My parents are cutting down the oak tree that has been my sanctuary for the miserable childhood they have put me through, so I called the real owners of the land and now they are screwed. My parents ran a business together and constantly fought. I mean constantly. The fights would sometimes devolve into physical altercations that were terrifying to me. I was an only child, so I think I'm the only person in the world besides them who knows how bad it actually got. To the outside world, we were a very normal family. When I was 6, my grandpa asked me what I wanted most for my birthday. Even then I knew I wanted to escape, so I said a tree house. I helped my grandpa with every single nail in that place and it became my literal sanctuary when there was utter chaos in my house. I was in there when it was 100 degrees outside. I was in there when it was below freezing. I painted it every year, I decorated it, and I treated it like it was almost a religious retreat for me. I came home every summer from college and cleaned, painted, and even slept in it most of the time. I permanently moved out about a year ago, but I also had fantasies that I could someday introduce my kids to my tree house someday. In my ultimate pie-in-the-sky dreams, I thought about taking it apart board by board and reassembling it in my own yard. Yesterday I got an email from my mom that almost as a footnote, she said very casually, "Oh, me and your father are tearing out that old oak tree with your ugly tree house and finally putting in a gazebo with a hot tub. Aren't you excited for us?" My parents always denied how much they scared me when they fought. They also flat out denied that the fights got as bad as they did. Or they say that since they found Christ, the fights and altercations have been forgiven and I should forgive them too. But I just can't forget, and now threatening to tear down my special space seems like the ultimate admission that they either don't know or just don't care how much they tormented me with their constant battles. I'm crushed over this. Apparently it's coming down Saturday and I just can't get home to do anything about it. I asked politely if they could try to save the pieces and my mom said, "We're hiring laborers. I just don't think they'll care enough to try. Thanks a lot, Mom." What can I do here? I'm so crushed. Is this just a part of growing up and being an adult that I have to deal with? Should I pay over $1,200 for a last-minute ticket tomorrow and try to save as much as I can? Update. So end story is I called my mom to please take several pictures of the treehouse for me, from several angles and inside. She was so rude and dismissive and said something along the lines of, "Oh, Jenny, we don't have time for that and you can't expect us to climb up into that piece of junk?" I was heartbroken all over again because she was callous. I decided that the only way I was going to have any keepsakes was to fly home and either take pictures myself or save as much of the wood as I could. I bought a really expensive last-minute ticket home. After I'd already paid for the ticket, I remembered that maybe my neighbor would be willing to take some pictures for me. They are an elderly couple, but they had almost been like surrogate grandparents. Mr. Smith prided himself on being in great shape, so I figured it couldn't hurt to ask him for pictures just in case I didn't make it home in time. To say it was an odd conversation is an understatement. I'll just type it out to the best of my memory. Me: "Hi Mrs. Smith. It's Jenny from next door. Are you guys in town by chance?" Mrs. Smith: "Jenny, it's so good to hear from you. No, we are at our place. Is there something I can do for you? Is everything okay?" Me: "Well, not really. My parents are tearing down the oak tree with my..." Mrs. Smith: "What? They are doing what?" Me: "They are tearing down that oak tree with my treehouse." Mrs. Smith: "No, they can't do that. That's our oak tree." Me: "Well, I think either Friday or Saturday. They are having people over to cut it all down." Mrs. Smith: "Jenny, I need to make some calls. I'm sorry I need to let you go. I'll try to call you back." So I flew home early Friday morning. My parents had hired some laborers from Home Depot but weren't home. They were well underway tearing my treehouse down. I approached them and asked if I could pay them to set aside the boards and metal parts and not throw them in the dumpster they had brought. They agreed, and I was able to save almost all the wood in a very neat pile. I even tried to number everything so if I ever do get to rebuild it someday, I know what goes together. It wasn't ideal, but I feel fortunate that I did get to save most everything. I'd say at maybe 6 p.m. my parents finally showed up and they were as mad as I've ever seen them. They weren't even happy to see me. What it turns out, the neighbors had their lawyer issue an injunction against tearing the tree down. I can't even begin to say how angry my parents were. And they didn't even really speak to me to tell me what was going on, so I called Mr. and Mrs. Smith back. It took until Saturday, but finally they called and they told me that basically there had been a surveying mistake when my parents had built their house in the 80s and the tree had actually been on the Smiths' property the whole time. They told me they always had an uneasy peace with my parents over the error and had never minded having a tree house in the tree, but chopping it down was crossing a major line. They said the tree gave them great shade in the summer mornings and they could not imagine tearing it down for any reason. They asked me what my parents' reasons were and I told him about the gazebo, and he literally started laughing that my parents had the nerve to knowingly build a gazebo on their property. He said he'd always planned on legally deeding the property over to my parents since it's only about an 11-foot error along the entire property, but since he thinks my parents purposefully waited until he and Mrs. Smith were out of town to rip down the tree, he wasn't in any mood to do them favors. Saturday was so awkward and I spent the night at a friend from HS. This morning my dad said he wanted my crap off his property, so I called the Smiths back and they said they didn't mind if I stored my wood in their barn as long as I need it. My parents went to church and I plan on leaving without saying goodbye. I had some memorabilia boxes in the attic. I am taking them to a friend's house and she's going to ship them to me, so there's nothing left in the house for my parents to take their anger out on. I don't know how this will affect our relationship, but the reality is we haven't had much of one for a long time. I don't have any attachment to my childhood home anymore, so at least in the near term there's nothing for me to really go home to.